Welcome to Perspectives with Asima Silva. We're taping at WCCA TV in Worcester, Massachusetts. Today, we had a guest a couple weeks ago, Buba Dicko from Cameroon, and he shared with us a very interesting perspective on his journey of creating schools and education for the girls in his community. It was, to be honest with you, very shocking to me that even in this day and age, in the 21st century, we have countries where education, specifically for girls, is a challenge. And there are many people who will fight against it, and there are people who are fighting for it and do a great change in their community. Now, I've invited him again this week because I learned something else about him. He has a very interesting personal story. As you know, I love sharing inspirational, motivational, personal stories from people. I believe that's one of the best ways for us to learn and also reflect on our own actions and our own life and how we can progress and contribute to our own society. So thank you so much for coming back as a guest on our show. And one of the things that really interested me is last weekend you had spoken at WPI as a guest, and we had an event on human rights, and I had invited you to talk about some human rights that you may have seen, human rights violations that you may have endured and seen in your own country. And a lot of it was, to be honest, very shocking to me. For someone who grew up in the suburbs of Massachusetts, a lot of these descriptions are only seen in movies or books. And to meet someone who has endured it and to come out, what is shocking is you're still so calm. You're collected, you're calm. I am not quite sure if someone who has gone through what you have gone through would be as collected and so soft-spoken and could talk about certain experiences without becoming overwhelmed with so much emotion that you couldn't even communicate. That wasn't you. You were able to communicate through the description and what had happened, and I really wanted you to come back on our show because our show is Perspectives. Our show is all talking about stories that we are not familiar with or may not have heard, and the way people have been raised and their background is not familiar to many of us, especially me. I wasn't familiar with this kind of situations. So if you'd like to start and talk about, just give us a journey about your experiences, you growing up in Cameroon, your challenges, how you overcame it, share what you would think that it would create a great picture for people like me who have, yes, I've visited other countries, but it's been on tourists and been on vacation. It's not been living in the challenges and trying to work against those challenges.
Thank you very much, Asima, for having me again. I'm happy to be here for the second time, and I wish to be here as many times as possible. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, just a little correction on my names. So, my name is Buba Dicko, even though Buba is a short form of Abubakar.
Yes.
But those are the names that I have on my official documents, Buba Dicko, and those are the names I go with in Cameroon. Okay. Yeah, so you've surely piled up a lot of questions, a lot of stuff to talk about, but I will just try maybe to remember some of the things you raised and then maybe go gradually. So like you said, I also like sharing personal stories because personal stories are what people have undergone, and what people have undergone is so useful for listeners because everybody undergoes something in one way or the other, and learning the experiences of others can be useful in helping us shape our own circumstances when we face similar situations. So I grew up in a small locality in northwest Cameroon called Wom. Yeah, so Wom is a bit famous for one other important thing that happened in 1986, and I like talking about this because a lot of people will always say, okay, I know Wom just because of that incident in 1986. There is this crater lake in Wom, around Wom, called Lake Nyos, which exploded with toxic gases in 1986 and killed over 2,000 people and animals. So that's what is a bit peculiar about womb.
Okay.
Something which a lot of people don't want to talk about today because of the misery, because of the lives that were lost, you know, and a lot of family members, my own community members, were affected by this incident. So I grew up in Womb at a time when secular education wasn't really accepted in my community, for reasons of some sort of suspicion and distrust based on cultural norms from a very orthodox community like the one I came from.
So when you say secular education,
yeah,
what exactly, because not everybody knows what that would
so
entail.
what I mean by secular education, Western education in general, in the broader sense.
Okay.
Yeah, so my community has stood on the fence for a very long time, hindering their kids to go to school just because they felt that there was an infringement into their culture, that going to school wasn't compatible with the local traditional setup, cultural setup of the community.
Okay.
And so it prevented a lot of people in a wider perspective, and according to my being here at Clark University, there seems to be a convention that has been established over time in communities which has affected that community for a very long time. I remember when I was 21 years ago, when I was in secondary school, we were only 4 of us in that secondary school from my community. You can imagine what proportion of the community would have been, you know, represented by just
right.
4 of us, you know. So one other thing that has hindered people from going to school in that community is also young boys were married off early enough in life. Okay. That whenever you get married, you take up community life, you know. And
what age are we talking about?
Yeah, so usually the boys got married at the age of 15 or slightly, sometimes below that, depending on family situations.
Okay.
So that was a serious problem, and I grew up to notice that that was something that was coming up to hinder even my own education, and I started working on it.
When you said they're marrying at 15, just out of curiosity, because of the situation that you're living in, are the kids maturing faster? Because I'm relating that to a kid at 15, you know, in the area I live in, and I can tell you the way they're being raised in the communities here, I would not think a 15-year-old is mature enough to be married. So can you please put that into perspective?
Yeah, so usually I don't think there's any biological differences that would explain that some communities, children from some communities get matured earlier than others. I don't know, I don't think that that's even the question here. But the problem here was more of a tradition,
okay,
right? And sometimes those marriages were even constructed, put in place at early childhood of those children, through betrothal, right? So children were betrothed to each other, sometimes even at birth. They just grew up to know that, okay, we're husband and
right.
wife.
That is shocking. I had assumed, and I'm stuttering because it's shocking even to hear it again, that practice was like 500 years ago, not something that's still occurring in this day and age. But please.
Yeah, of course, in some communities, in some societies, that is something of the past, but in many societies, that is still happening. That is still happening. It is still happening in my community, even as we speak, but
okay,
at a very reduced level, because popular cultures have come to erode a lot
right,
of those beliefs, you know. That would have been a problem to me, to my education myself, but I was able to think about it well ahead of time and then sought alternative ways of circumventing it, you know, living with it and achieving my educational dreams and goals, you know. Yeah. So.
And where did that come from? Where did the motivation for you to see a different path than what was outlined to you by your community, your culture. Is it because you were seeing everyone else and you wanted something different, or did you see somebody that you wanted to emulate, and that's how you...
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think the answer to that question comes from one window in my life. So I come from a very big family, and I tended to grow up alone, isolated from the top and the bottom in my family, just because there was no one of my age with whom I grew with. So I spent a lot of time alone in isolation, and I think that helped to shape my perspective, my worldview.
You were able to think for yourself.
I had used a lot of time thinking, pondering, you know, and then looked at situations and tried to, you know, develop a critical mind. So early on, I realized, because there was nothing that motivated me, you know, to drop out of school and get married, because I was thinking of, you know, having some sort of long-term impact in my community, yep. And I saw that as an angle from where I can do something reasonable. So, and I immediately at that age realized that standing against that culture, that tradition, was going to be futile and would only antagonize me with the community and reduce my chances of ever having a voice to speak about these things. So rather, I started thinking of alternative ways of letting people know that you can still keep the early marriage, but at the same time continue to succeed, continue to pursue other goals in life and succeed. And when the time came for me to get married, you know, it wasn't easy from the start, because die-hard traditionalists saw that as some sort of sacrilege, you know, yep. Some sort of outright violation, standing against the culture of the community. But I think I persevered, you know. I was married at Form 4 in the 4th grade in secondary school. Okay. And I succeeded to move right up to completing the secondary school, high school, the university, and a professional school, you know. Okay. Yeah. So I thought that instead of talking to people about early marriages and how you can succeed while married, the best way would be to do it myself and then come out as a successful person and then let people learn from that experience, you know. And I think it worked very well, because when I look back today, I look back with a lot of satisfaction as to the number of young boys today who are in school while still married. I think people have learned to live with it as a culture and at the same time succeed in their educational dreams, goals. Yeah. So
you went to university. How did you... I want to know what happened after that. I mean, if you didn't stop there. You kept going.
Yeah, I kept going, you know, and I said to myself, this is a challenge. This is something a lot of people see as an impossibility, but nothing is impossible for me. And you know, at that early age, I had developed this critical mind of always not wanting to listen to what people say about things. I want to try them myself. And the experience of someone in whatever situation doesn't, like, you know, discourage me from venturing in that very area. I feel that circumstances are not always constant. Situations will always change, you know. And so what might have happened to A or B 2 or 3 years back might not be the same scenario to happen to me, right? So, and I think this helped me so much when I got into work. It opened me up to another angle from where I thought I would be more useful to my community and to my country. I started exploiting the civil society space, you know, and you know, in a lot of countries, sometimes the state governments make conscious efforts, you know, to contract that space, you know, to suppress voices, you know, of people in the civil society space. But I think the resilience I learned to have from that early age helped to shape my perspective to be able to navigate and circumvent, you know, some of those hurdles and still make impact in the civil society.
So in the human rights violation event, you mentioned, you know, education, but you mentioned a few other things. If you don't mind touching on that, but I would like to know, not just touch on it, but how did you overcome it? Psychologically, mentally, emotionally, and still try to keep pursuing in the path that you have been on?
Yeah, so let me just touch a bit on what it all constituted, you know, just for the benefit of those, because we've spoken about this, you know.
But yes, our viewers need to know the background.
Yeah, sure. I became interested in human rights activism just because of the circumstances that I grew up with. Like, I grew up in a community which is purely pastoral, people who lived with cattle and with the lowest level of scholarization, of literacy, you know. And, you know, in some areas, when people have wealth without a proportionate degree of awareness, that wealth is always seen as possible, you know, preying opportunities by some sort of predators, you know, in communities who always want to violate the rights of people in order to grab their rights and have what they have, you know. So I grew up to see a lot of human rights violations in terms of exploitation, financial extortion, arbitrary arrest and detention of community members, you know, and that wasn't pleasing to me, you know. And these acts were perpetrated by people who have been charged with maintaining the law, you know. It's so pathetic that sometimes, you know, forces of law and order at some point were described as forces of disorder, of lawlessness and disorder, you know. By perpetuating all this type of terrible human rights violations on people, on ordinary people, you know. I grew up to observe a lot of these things happen around me, you know, and so I was really inspired, you know. I like quoting this saying in Arabic language because it was that very day when I got exposed to this statement that I started changing my perspective, you know, instead of just being a passive observer of the disturbing situation that's happening around me, to someone who wants to take active, you know, proactive measures to tackle those things. And this statement is the statement of a famous Islamic scholar, and I like quoting it the way he wrote it. He said, وَمَا قِيمَةُ الْأَوْطَانِ إِلَّمْ يَكُنْ لَهَا رِجَالٌ يَلُذُّونَ الشَّقَاءَ لِيَنْفَعُوا. That what is the worth of a community if there are no people within that community who will push away evil, and then do common good and work on common good. And I started asking myself, where do I fit in? Will I just continuously be the watcher, the observer, the spectator of all these terrible things happening around? Or can I do something? Can I be one of these people who will push away evil and then work for common good? And so that was the moment I started telling myself, okay, you got to do something, right? And I understood the terrain very well. I knew that venturing in human rights activism was going to pour some dangerous consequences, you know, just because of the experience of other human rights activists around the environment, so around the country. You know, I knew this was not going to go well. And so I started working on a platform, you know, that would provide some sort of alarms in case those trouble moments come up, you know, by first of all creating a community-based organization, and then liaising with human rights institutions and civil society organizations, where I was able to get, the support of lawyers and other human rights activists who will easily ring the bell,
Yeah.
And so we started intervening in human rights violation cases. But one thing that caused the trigger was at one point in time when I sat down and told myself, okay, fighting these cases on individual basis is not going to yield the results rapidly.
Right.
Rather, we needed to put in place a collective strategy that will explode at a particular period and then,
Right.
produce a more effective results. And so I sat down at one point in time and did a small study. Within 2 months, I was able to, record any human rights violation on that community. The office or the perpetrator that was involved, the date, the motive, what financial extortion was involved, I recorded all those details, and the data was mind-blowing. You cannot imagine that within 2 months, about 2,800,000 that is about, I think, $4,000 or something like that, in terms of dollars, that was extorted from local community members within 2 months, from 38 different community members,
How much is that in dollars?
That should be 4,000 something dollars.
Okay.
And I told myself, okay, if this trend is allowed to continue in the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, these local people will be impoverished, and that will have a negative, effect on the entire community, on the entire society, because when you deprive people of their wealth, their property, their livelihood, you're forcing them to start devising unorthodox means of living,
Right.
That's just going to cause an upsurge in crime wave. And so I decided to move up with these figures to human rights organizations, and say, okay, look at these. These are not figures that someone would look away from. These are real appealing figures, And so from that, we ended up with a massive mobilization, and then a big come together where different stakeholders were brought together, and we exposed all these ills, spoke about all these situations, but that wasn't pleasing to
Did you get any backlash?
To some people, obviously, and I was expecting that,
Right.
Yeah. So 2 days later, I received a summons from the state prosecutor. The allegation was,
So you're trying to stop corruption, but then you get charged.
Yeah, but they weren't tagging it as corruption,
Right.
And the bad side of it is the same local communities were the ones who were, brainwashed and, entangled into all these, dirty games to fight against something that is in their own favor, And so it ended up with an arrest for me. 2 of us, myself and one of my collaborators, we were arrested, were detained for days. And that case went into the court for 6 months. We've been pulled left and right, It was thanks to intervention from some stakeholders, from human rights organizations and civil society organizations, that we were able to get discharged and acquitted.
How long did it take?
It took 6 months.
6 months.
For us to get free from from that case. Talking about how we survived after that, it was really traumatic. It wasn't easy to bear, but it was something we expected,
and you took the risk.
Similar things happened to a lot of people around, so we were not the first, and we will never be the last. you know. So we took that as a challenge to do even more. And I think it's thanks to that incident that I was nominated to the International Visitor Leadership Program at the Department of State in 2015. And I was here in the US for 1 month, where I got exposed to more human rights, you know, information and US foreign policies. So at the end, I think
it turned into a blessing.
Yeah, it turned into a blessing. Yeah.
So we only have a minute or so left, but from your perspective, looking back, you said that this was a blessing and it moved forward. But what personal things did you have to sacrifice? If you can just tell us in a minute. Like if you were detained for detained, and then it took you 6 months out of this case, what personal, like in terms of family, in terms of financial, hit did you have to take?
Yeah, so it was, you know, I come from a community where people fear arrest a lot, even when they are right.
Right.
They fear to be arrested, you know.
Right.
And I thought that there would be no way for them to get free from being arrested anyhow, illegally, if they don't withstand those arrests, you know.
Right.
So I was ready. I didn't fear being arrested, even though my family didn't take it lightly. It wasn't easy, but they came to understand, the community at large came to understand that people need to make sacrifices in order to be free from certain ills, you know. Financial wise, I want to thank particularly frontline defenders, you know, cultural survivor here in the US, you know, minority rights groups, Minority Rights Groups International in the UK, and Justice and Dignity Campaign.
Right.
They were all very strong stakeholders, you know, who brought in their weight into this case. A lot of correspondences were written and flooded the Prime Minister's office on our case, you know, and I think that helped so much. Even in paying lawyers for the case, we received a lot of support. I'm grateful to all these human rights organizations.
Well, thank you so much. We're almost out of time, so let me just recap a little bit and share with you my perspective. So from the story we've heard, one thing to take away is standing up for what's right, and it requires sometimes knowing that there's going to be a lot of self-sacrifice and taking risks. And from what you have heard, that sometimes that really turns into a blessing. Now it's amazing that he had, you know, the international community and human rights organizations flooding the Prime Minister's office with letters of asking him to be let go. And that's why he finds himself at Clark University in America now, doing his studies, furthering what he can do and bring back to his community. So I leave you with one thing, and as I always say on Perspectives, doing good is never gonna backfire. It will always turn into blessings. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you join again.